Berlin, 1945. A bunker beneath the rubble. A gunshot and a burning body. Or was it a getaway plan? Welcome to Probably Not True, where we drag history's weirdest stories into the daylight and ruin them with facts. Today we're diving into one of history's most persistent and most bizarre conspiracy theories. Did Adolf Hitler fake his death and escape to Argentina? Forget your high school history class, because this story has it all. Secret submarines, underground tunnels, forged identities, and more Nazis lounging on South American beaches than at a Bond villain's retirement party. The spring of 1945 wasn't just bad for Hitler, it was catastrophic. The once mighty Nazi regime was collapsing from all sides. In the west, American, British and French forces were closing in relentlessly. In the east, the Soviet Red Army, led by the formidable Marshal Georgy Zhukov, was pounding Berlin into rubble, block by block. Hitler, the architect of a brutal dictatorship and a global conflict, was reduced to nothing but a fugitive in his own capital, hiding in the Führer bunker, a cold, claustrophobic concrete labyrinth buried beneath the Reich Chancellery Gardens. It was designed to protect him from the bombs falling down, but ultimately became his final tomb. By late April, Berlin was surrounded. The city was a smouldering ruin, and morale amongst Hitler's inner circle had evaporated. On April 29, 1945, with Soviet forces just streets away, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief, sombre ceremony inside the bunker. Now, according to witnesses, the event was eerily formal. Hitler wore a rumpled, grease-stained uniform. Braun opted for a plain black dress, a stark contrast to the lavish weddings of the Nazi elite just a few years prior. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration, only a grim, palpable sense that the end was not just near, it was inevitable. The following day, April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Braun said their final goodbyes to the dwindling remnants of the Third Reich. According to accounts from survivors, Hitler retreated to his private quarters, sat on a worn sofa, and in a grim and final act, shot himself in the right temple with a Walther PPK pistol. Braun, meanwhile, ingested a cyanide capsule. Per Hitler's explicit instructions, their bodies were swiftly carried up the garden outside, doused in petrol, and set ablaze. As the flames consumed their remains, Berlin burned around them, and the Third Reich crumbled into dust. Or so the official story goes. Almost immediately after the war, rumours began circulating that Hitler hadn't died in the bunker. Some claimed that the bodies burned beyond recognition were decoys. Others pointed to the hasty Soviet recovery and inconsistencies in their reports. Whispers grew louder over the decades, suggesting that Hitler had slipped away, using secret underground tunnels or even escaping via submarine to Argentina, a country that would curiously become a haven for many high-ranking Nazi fugitives in the years to follow. But why Argentina? How plausible is the idea that Hitler could have faked his death and started a new life in the shadow of South America? And what does the evidence, both the conspiracy theorists and the historians, really tell us? Today we pull back the curtain on one of history's most infamous mysteries. Enter the Soviets. If there was ever a regime built for breeding conspiracy theories, it was Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. Paranoia, secrecy, and misinformation were all a part of the Soviet political DNA, and their handling of Hitler's death was no exception. In the immediate aftermath of Berlin's fall, the Soviets claimed to have recovered what remained of Hitler's body, or at least what was left of it after the fire and the brutal siege. However, instead of providing clear evidence to the world, they shrouded the entire affair in mystery. Initial Soviet reports on Hitler's death were murky at best and flat-out contradictory at worst. At times they claimed to have his remains, and at others they suggested that Hitler had fled. Stalin himself reportedly told Allied leaders at the Potsdam Conference that he believed Hitler had escaped, perhaps to Spain or South America. Now, whether this was genuine belief or classic Soviet disinformation designed to unsettle the West is still debated to this day. Regardless, the Soviets refused to release any photographs of the recovered body, and they offered only limited and conflicting autopsy details, and kept Hitler's alleged remains under tight lock and key. The KGB, and later the FSB, continued this policy of secrecy for decades. Skeptics argued that if the Soviets truly had conclusive proof, they'd have paraded it in front of the world. But instead, the lack of transparency allowed myths to flourish. These were fueled by Cold War distrust and a general appetite for all things intrigue. But the real gasoline on the fire came much, much later. Fast forward to 2009. For decades, the Russians had kept a skull fragment, reportedly recovered from the garden near the Führer bunker, stored in their archives. Now this fragment was held up as one of the few tangible pieces of evidence that Hitler had indeed died in Berlin. It bore a bullet hole and was believed to be a part of Hitler's own cranium. That was until modern science got involved. A team of American researchers were granted access to the skull fragment. Using cutting-edge DNA testing methods, they analysed the bone and made a shocking discovery. The skull did not belong to Adolf Hitler. In fact, it didn't belong to any man at all. The DNA indicated that the bone came from a woman, likely under the age of 40. Now some have speculated it could have belonged to Eva Braun, Hitler's newly wedded companion, who also died by suicide. However, even that claim ran into problems. There was no definitive evidence tying the fragment to her either. With this revelation, the already fragile official narrative began to unravel. If the skull wasn't Hitler's, what else about the story was wrong? Had the Soviets, intentionally or not, misled the world? Was it possible that Hitler had staged his death, swapped bodies, and fled Berlin under the chaos of the Soviet siege? These new findings reignited decades-old conspiracy theories, pushing some researchers and amateur sleuths to dig deeper into the claims that Hitler had not died in the bunker after all, but had indeed vanished into the shadows, possibly resurfacing under a new identity. Thousands of miles away in the wind-swept plains and bustling cities of southern America. But how plausible is that escape route really? Next, we'll follow the trail across oceans, through secret Nazi networks and into the heartland of Argentina. One of the more elaborate and enduring theories surrounding Hitler's alleged escape paints a picture straight out of a spy thriller. According to this version of events, Hitler and Eva didn't die in the confines of the Führer bunker. Instead, they slipped away through a network of underground tunnels that connected the bunker complex to various points in Berlin, including, crucially, Tempelhof Airport. Now Tempelhof, one of the largest and most advanced airports of its time, had remained in partial operation even as Berlin began to fall into ruin. Some conspiracy theorists argue that amidst the chaos of the Soviet advance, a small window of opportunity did present itself. Hitler, disguised and escorted by loyalists, supposedly made their way to the airport's hidden runways, and there they boarded a lightweight aircraft. Nazi planes at these times were known for short takeoffs and landing capabilities, and they took off under the cover of the night. Allegedly their destination? Spain. Under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, Spain was a natural refuge for fleeing Nazis. Franco owed a political debt to Hitler due to Hitler's support during the Spanish Civil War, and Spain maintained a policy of ambiguous neutrality during World War II. According to this theory, Hitler and Braun found temporary shelter there before embarking on the next leg of their journey, which happened to be an escape across the Atlantic Ocean. The final phase of this escape plan involved a German U-boat, a submarine capable of traversing long distances undetected. Nazi Germany had an extensive submarine fleet, and a handful of U-boats were confirmed to have made it to South American shores in the waning days of the war. In this version of events, Hitler and Braun slipped aboard a waiting U-boat off the coast of Spain and were spirited across the Atlantic to start a new life in Argentina. Now, why Argentina? At the time, it was arguably one of the safest destinations for high-ranking Nazis on the run. Under the leadership of President Juan Perón, Argentina maintained a sympathetic stance towards Axis powers. More importantly, the country already had a large German immigrant population, especially in the Patagonia region, making it far easier for escapees to blend in. The Argentine government reportedly were willing to turn a blind eye to the arrival of former Nazis, offering them refuge in exchange for the promise of technological expertise and political support during Perón's consolidation of power. This theory gained significant mainstream attention thanks to the 2011 book Grey Wolf: The Escape of Adolf Hitler by Simon Dunstan and Gerard Williams. In Grey Wolf, the authors argue that not only did Hitler survive, but he lived out his days in the remote wilderness of Patagonia. According to their account, Hitler adopted the alias Adolf Schüttelmeer, settled into a quiet life far away from the ruins of Europe, and even fathered 2 daughters. Dunstan and Williams claim that Hitler lived in relative obscurity until his death in 1962, well into the Cold War era. Now, Grey Wolf sparked widespread debate, tapping into the public's long-standing fascination with the possibility that one of history's most reviled figures may have cheated justice and escaped to the ends of the earth. But does any of this hold up to scrutiny? Next, we'll examine the cracks in the theory, and whether the hard evidence supports or shatters the story of the Führer's great escape. Importantly, and here's where things get really spicy, many high-ranking Nazis did manage to escape to South America. This isn't a wild speculation, and this isn't a theory, it's historical fact. Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Chile became unexpected retirement homes for some of the Third Reich's most notorious alumni. Adolf Eichmann, the civil servant, the architect of the Holocaust logistics, was famously captured by Israeli agents in Buenos Aires in 1960, living under the uninspired alias of Ricardo Clement. He was extradited, back to Israel, where he stood trial and was subsequently hanged. Then there was Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death, who evaded capture for decades. Mengele reportedly enjoyed beach holidays in Brazil, while the rest of the world hunted for him like he was a particularly elusive cockroach. And their escape routes? They weren't just last-minute sprints into the jungle. They were highly organised networks called the Rat Lines, clandestine corridors of escape often facilitated by a charming combination of ex-Nazis, shady diplomats, corrupt officials, and even some sympathetic members of the clergy. Think of it like a really dark version of the Witness Protection Programme, if all the witnesses were war criminals. So yes, plenty of Nazis made the trip, but was Hitler amongst them? The evidence, the real, non-tinfoil hat-wearing kind of evidence, says absolutely not. Don't be ridiculous. Now, let's start with the big ticket item, his teeth. Hitler was notoriously paranoid about dentists, which is pretty understandable given the state of 1940s dental technology. But even tyrants have to sit in the chair eventually. Forensic analysis of Hitler's dental remains, and specifically his teeth and jawbone, matched them against his known dental records, which were thoroughly documented thanks to the meticulous, mildly horrifying work of his personal dentist and all of their assistants. Now, these people knew every grimy detail of Hitler's chompers, and after the war they provided detailed testimony about his dental work, down to the bridgework and fillings. When compared, the match was practically forensic catnip. And there's more. In 2018, French forensic experts re-examined the jawbone, still chilling out in a Russian archive, and found further confirmation. The analysis showed unmistakable evidence of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The damage to the jaw and the teeth were consistent with a bullet fired upwards into the head at close range. Textbook suicide mechanics. Now, unless Hitler somehow staged dental records, hired a body double with identical cavities, and time-travelled to Russia to fake a 70-year-old jawbone, this is pretty conclusive evidence. Beyond the physical evidence, there's also the simple, unglamorous reality of Hitler's health in his final days. Reports from those trapped in the bunker with him describe a man who was a physical wreck, a drug-addicted, frail, stooped, trembling, likely from advanced Parkinson's disease, and also emotionally unstable. As if we didn't know that about Hitler. Very mentally stable guy. Hardly the sort of person you'd pick for a daring midnight flight, followed by a submarine voyage and a new career as a Patagonia sheep farmer. And then there's Hitler's ideology to consider. This man's entire worldview was built on a toxic cocktail of messianic delusion and death before dishonour bravado. Surrender was just not acceptable. It was unthinkable for Hitler's ethos. For him, defeat was equivalent to annihilation. Escaping, living in secret, growing a weird mustache-free beard in Argentina, this would have been a betrayal of the myth he worked so hard to cultivate about the German people and about himself. He was not the kind of guy to ghost his own apocalypse. So whilst many Nazis fled, Hitler wasn't sipping Malbec under the Patagonia sunshine. He died the way he lived, a bitter, deluded old man surrounded by concrete. So why, even after all this time and all the evidence, do conspiracy theories about Hitler's survival refuse to die? Well, first off, we can thank the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin and his merry band of professional secret keepers weren't exactly the most transparent and open people. From the very moment that Berlin fell, the Soviets took control of the narrative, and more accurately, took control of no narrative. They released conflicting reports, denied access to evidence, and hinted, sometimes not so subtly, that maybe, just maybe, Hitler had slipped through their fingers. Some historians argue that this was deliberate. a Cold War mind game designed to unsettle the West. And others think this was just classic Soviet bureaucracy, a mix of chaos, mistrust, and a pathological love of secrecy. Either way, their handling of the situation did create the perfect fog of uncertainty, and this conspiracy theory thrives in the uncertainty. Secondly, the survival narrative isn't entirely baseless because, as we covered, lots of Nazis did escape. People hear that the real-life monsters, like Eichmann and Mengele, made it out and lived relatively normal lives in South America, and raised families and other jobs. It lends a sheen of plausibility to the idea that Hitler could have done the same. If the henchman made it, why not the big boss? And it's a very fair question. But you have to remember that Mengele and Eichmann weren't broken, trembling meth addicts suffering from neurological disorders in 1945. They were relatively young and mobile, and they still had the energy to pack a suitcase and hit the road. Hitler, by contrast, was more haunted house attraction than fugitive mastermind by the time Berlin was burning. The man was addicted to meth, crying in a bunker. He wasn't going anywhere in a hurry. Now finally, there's a deeper psychological reason, and that is that humans are irresistibly drawn to unresolved mysteries. It's why this is my first episode, because we love a good unsolved case, and it makes history feel alive, breathing, still up for grabs, unwritten, unclaimed. A clear closed ending is boring. A question mark invites endless speculation, books, documentary, History Channel specials, pub debates. The whole premise of this podcast. The idea that Hitler could have escaped and lived out his days in secrecy allows us to imagine an alternate history, a tantalising what-if scenario that makes the past seem less settled and somehow a lot more thrilling. But here's the interesting thing. When you strip away the Hollywood drama, the pseudo-science and the Cold War smokescreens, you are left with one stubborn fact. The evidence, forensic, testimonial, documented, overwhelmingly supports the conclusion that Adolf Hitler died in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. His dental remains match, his jawbone matches, the witness accounts are consistent, the forensics scream suicide, not submarine. The idea that he escaped is a fascinating piece of speculative fiction, and it's perfect for late night debates, documentaries, Netflix docuseries, arguments, but it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It is a myth, not a mystery. Hitler didn't vanish into the sunset. He died exactly where history says he did, bitter, broken, and buried under the ruins of the empire that he destroyed. Final score? Hitler escape theory, 1 out of 10 secret submarines. Now this is mostly for creative storytelling, and for giving us the mental image of Hitler trying to grow a low-effort disguised mustache in the Patagonian wilderness. Thank you for tuning in to episode 1 of Probably Not True, where history's weirdest, wildest and most stubborn myths get dragged into the sunlight and absolutely ruined by pesky little things called facts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical nonsense, please do us a favour. Hit follow, leave a review and tell a friend. Preferably the one who still insists that Hitler's alive and plotting in a secret volcano lair somewhere. We all got one of those. For bonus episodes, behind the scenes chaos and even more wild history deep dives that we couldn't fit into the regular show, check out our Patreon, link coming soon. Support the show, fuel our caffeine habits, and help us keep dragging history skeletons out of the closets. Next time on Probably Not True, did aliens build the pyramids? Spoiler alert. Probably not true.